From the City of Angels near the Pacific Ocean, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, Leaving the Trap, how to exit the reincarnation cycle. Here's what's happening. A gunman is in custody after shots were fired inside a medical building in Texas, leaving a physician and a patient injured. The Cedar Hill Police Department said the officers were dispatched there for a call of an active shooter. When they arrived, they found one victim with a gunshot wound on the ground in front of the clinic. Authorities said they observed a man with a long gun fleeing the scene in a vehicle. He is in custody. A shooting that erupted in a Houston park over the weekend that left a pregnant woman dead and 4 other people injured has marked the 400th mass shooting in the United States in 2023. The Houston incident was among 6 mass shootings that occurred on Saturday and early Sunday in cities across the nation. In a moment, John Lott joins us, author of More Guns, Less Crime, to talk about this situation. With a little over 5 months to go in the year, the number of mass shootings is up 9% from 365 mass shootings that occurred this time of year in 2022. American patriotism has faced a steep decline among young adults over the last decade and now sits at a record low. Pride in national identity is lowest among 18 to 34-year-olds and illustrates the fracture between young Americans and older generations at a time of deep partisanship in the United States. Dr. John Curtis, onlinecolumnist.com, with us here. John, there's a great divide in this country.
Well, I mean, we all know about the political divide. And, you know, certainly when you have the Vice President of the United States getting up and claiming that we're a systemically racist country and that, you know, the slavery reparations need to be paid, that kind of thing, I mean, it really does create a vast divide. But I think the problem today with patriotism is not only is it not something that's taught in the schools. I'm talking about civics education. It's really not part of normal curriculum anymore across the United States. We have a mass influx of immigrants in the United States, many of whom came illegally. But let's face it, they're here and they're balkanized today. Without some kind of, you know, common denominator, without some type of a opportunity to learn what it means, that disputes over history right now are very extreme, especially when it comes to African Americans, Native Americans. And I just think that with these influxes, mass immigration influxes, you just don't have people that are seeking assimilation anymore, George. You know, in the old days, you know, you wanted to learn the language. And immigrants coming to the United States wanted to be Americans. They wanted to eat like Americans. They wanted to dress like Americans. They wanted to act like Americans. Today, it's considered an insult to ethnic minorities to expect them to be American. And I think that accounts for why there's low patriotism scores, because there is no longer an American identity. It is a balkanized identity of individual groups that have come and immigrated here.
I got to tell you, John, a couple of years ago, I went to Mexico. I came home and kissed the ground of the United States. I was so glad to be back. So many things are working against the would-be homebuyers this summer. The housing market remains stuck, with sales pushed lower by a lack of both affordability and inventory. Recent credit tightening, higher interest rates, and home prices firming up across the country after a brief correction last fall. Noted author John Truman Wolfe with us. John, this is not a good situation for housing or people.
It's not, George. You know, with the rates going up, payments are going up, makes homes less affordable. Fewer people qualify. The real estate market, George, is down about 25%, driven primarily by increased interest rates. It's not good, and the Fed has talked about increasing rates another couple of times by the end of the year. So if somebody's looking at buying, you know, I would do it now Jerome Powell has said it'll be a couple of years before they look at lowering rates. So the real estate market is rather stuck, and that's the reason.
I've got a couple of people that invest heavily into real estate as friends, and they think they're going to get out of everything right now.
Yeah, I think that's right now. I think that's smart. It's just not. It's not a healthy industry. It's been, and prior to these rates going up, it was humming along, and all of a sudden it hasn't come to a screeching halt, but it has come to a screeching slowdown. It's not a healthy industry as we speak.
That's true. John, thank you so much. In a moment, John Lott joins us. We're going to talk about the gun situation in America. Next hour, we'll take your calls with him on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. John Lott Jr. with us, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. He's an economist who has held various research and teaching positions at places such as the University of Chicago, Yale, Wharton, Stanford, and UCLA. John was the chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission and recently the senior advisor for research and statistics at the U.S. Department of Justice, author of a number of books including More Guns, Less Crime, Gun Control Myths, Freedomonomics as well. John, welcome back, my friend. How have you been?
Doing great. It's great to talk to you again. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for being there.
Lots going on these days, my friend. How did you get interested in talking about guns? What was that?
Oh, it was completely by accident. I really had little interest in the topic. I had written a number of scholarly papers on crime, and I had been chief economist at the Sentencing Commission. But I was teaching at the Wharton Business School, and I made basically a class on white-collar and corporate crime. And I made the mistake of telling the students that we were ahead in the syllabus. And I had a couple students that came up to me after class, and they said, well, they realized it wasn't quite on topic, though obviously it was still related to crime. And they were wondering if I had some extra time, if I could give a lecture on gun control. And I figured, okay, I can do that. It kind of forced me to read through more of the existing literature than I'd seen. The papers I'd seen were poorly done. And I was pretty shocked to see how poorly done all the research was in that area. And an academic, you do papers either because you have a new idea, which is like 95% of the papers that I've done, or you think you can do a better job. In fact, I almost stopped about 6 different times while I was working through the data on the paper just because I didn't find it that interesting. But I ended up finishing it, and I got a call from a guy named Dennis Cushan, who was a reporter for USA Today. I'd gotten to know Dennis a little bit when I was chief economist at the Sentencing Commission. And Dennis would call me up every 6 months or 8 months or whatever and ask me some questions. And so he asked me his questions, and then at the end he says, oh, by the way, what are you working on? And I said, well, I just finished this paper on concealed carry. I'd looked at 13 different types of gun control laws, but the only one that really seemed to make a beneficial difference was concealed carry. And he said, well, that sounded interesting, and asked me if I could send it to him. And I did, and a week later it was on the front page of USA Today, and things kind of took off from there, I guess. Normally I wouldn't have done more than a couple papers or a few papers in an area, but I had been involved in a lot of academic debates, but I had never seen so much misinformation being put out there as I did on the gun debate, and it kind of kept me involved. I just wasn't able to get away from it.
John, the story I had before you came on about the mass shootings that are occurring in the U.S., 400 already just this year alone. Most of them are being done by people who have not really had prior crimes before. What's happening to them?
Okay, so that's not true for the 400. What often happens is people will go and talk about these mass public shootings where somebody goes into a mall or a movie theater or a school, where the whole point of the attack is simply to go and kill other people. Yeah. And those are what you described, but those are pretty rare. I mean, you're talking about 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 of those a year compared to the 400 that you were just saying. And mass public shootings are shootings that occur in public, not involving some other crime like a gang fight over drug turf or a robbery. to try to get at those cases that get on the news. There's a gun control group out there called the Gun Violence Archive, which has its own definition. And they look at any time that 3 or more people are wounded and or killed in a shooting. And the vast majority of their cases, like 87% of them, are basically gang fights that occur over drug turf. Often the news articles don't mention whether or not these were rival gangs who were fighting against each other, which can sometimes be in a mall or whatever. It used to be that the media just didn't cover them very much because they knew they were gang fights, but now kind of with the new template, they cover them but don't mention often whether it's gangs. And most of the other ones, past that 87%, are robberies or other things like that where a crime was being committed. And, so what happens is that somebody will go and mention things like Uvalde or some of the other horrible attacks that occur, and then mention that there are 400 of these. I guess I would say, look, a gang fight over drug turf is bad. Getting people wounded or killed is bad. But the causes and solutions to those two different types of attacks are very, very different. And there's a reason why in the past the media has pretty much not given the same coverage to gang fights over drug turf that they give to the types of mass public shootings that, like a school shooting or a mall shooting where there's no gangs fighting against each other. It's solely an attempt to go and kill people.
Now, those people who just go and attempt to kill people, again, have they been convicted of other crimes in the past, generally?
Often not. What you have happen is you have people who want to commit suicide. I mean, obviously, people have always wanted to commit suicide. But someplace along the line, about 30 years ago or so, you had people who wanted to commit suicide, who felt that they weren't appreciated, who realized that if they took other people with them, they could kind of go out with a bang, so to speak. You read the diaries, you read the manifestos for these mass murders, and time after time you'll see things like, if I can only kill more people than such and such did, I can get even more media attention. My name will be in the history books. People will know that I was here. Those are the types of statements you just see constantly, and that's what motivates these guys. These guys want to get media attention, and it affects where they go to do the attacks.
Yeah.
And, because these guys may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to kill as many people as possible, and if they know they go to a place where their victims are not allowed to go and defend themselves, they're going to be more successful in killing more people. And you see this time after time. The Nashville school shooter, the Biden administration still has not released the diaries for this mass murder, but the Nashville police chief got a look at it, and he said that, in fact, this murderer had another venue, a mall apparently, as their first target, but had decided not to go after that mall because they saw that there were armed guards there, and they realized that civilians could carry concealed handguns there. So the person picked the school instead, where it didn't look like they had any protection.
The Mandalay Bay shooting that occurred several years ago.
Right.
That was from the 32nd floor. 61 people killed, right?
Right. 59, I think.
What happened to this guy? Stephen Paddock?
We don't know. It's one of these things where the FBI just hasn't really been forthcoming on the information that they might have with regard to it, and it's one of the bigger mysteries that are out there. I have to say, when I was working in the Department of Justice, I really got discouraged just how much politics there seemed to be in terms of at least the data people. I can't make a judgment beyond that because I only really worked with the data people at the FBI. But even the data people, I've worked with FBI data for 40 years, and I really have real doubts about how politics enter into the types of decisions they make on how they put data together and what they release.
We're with John Lott. We're talking about guns in America. We'll take calls with John next hour here on Coast to Coast. His website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. 23 years ago, John, you wrote a book called More Guns, Less Crime. It took America by storm. Tell us what you meant by that title.
Well, I mean, it's something that changed my views fairly dramatically. Up until that time, I was probably in the middle of the debate on guns. My wife was Swedish. She hated guns. She had a PhD in economics also. And, it was just something that was shocking. It was kind of what you found was that police were extremely important in reducing crime. Higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences were the most important. But you could also make it riskier for criminals to go and commit crime by allowing people to be able to go and defend themselves. That while the police are extremely important, what you find is that the police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And it's interesting, among the strongest supporters of private ownership of guns in the United States are police officers, because they know firsthand how important a gun is to their own protection. And they know firsthand how, even though they are extremely important in deterring crime, they get there almost always after the crimes occurred. And so, if you can have people defend themselves, and the thing is, what I found was that it's the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from owning guns. The two groups of people that I found that benefit the most were the ones who are most likely victims of violent crime, and that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about a male criminal doing the attack, and when a man is attacking a woman or an elderly person, there's a lot larger strength differential that exists there than when a man's attacking another man. And a gun makes a much bigger relative change in a woman or an elderly person's ability to go and defend themselves.
What happens? Paint us a scenario, John. If all legal guns were confiscated in this country, all legal guns, what would happen?
Right. Well, I mean, we've tried that in a couple of big cities in the United States, Chicago and Washington, D.C., but it's also been tried around the world in a number of places, banning either all guns or all handguns. And what you see is every single time that happens, murder rates and homicide rates go up. In the cases of Washington, D.C. and Chicago, gun control people will say, well, that wasn't a fair test, because unless you go and you ban guns every place in the country, people can go to Maryland or Virginia to get guns, or from the rest of Illinois or Indiana or Wisconsin to go and get guns. I suppose my response is it would have been nice if they had kind of told people before those laws were passed that they didn't think that they were going to work. But the main thing is it doesn't really explain why the murder rates went up. It explains maybe why it didn't go down, as they were predicting, because people were able to go and get guns from those other places to begin with. But there's a simple reason that every time that guns are banned, you see murder rates go up, and that is it kind of is related to the point that you were just making there about legal gun ownership. But the people who are most likely to obey that type of rule are the most law-abiding, good citizens. They're the ones who are likely to turn in. You may take a few guns away from the criminals, but if you primarily disarm their victims there, you make it relatively easier for criminals to commit crime. And the thing is, every country, even island nations, I mean, you think island nations like Jamaica or the Republic of Ireland or the UK would be kind of ideal experiments for them to go and ban guns. But in fact, what you find is that when they've done that, murder rates have gone up, even in island nations where they don't even have, some neighboring country that they can easily go and blame for the supply of guns that they have.
Is there a market, John, for illegal guns?
What?
Is there a market for illegal guns?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, probably the number one supplier of illegal guns are drug dealers. You can look at a country like Mexico, for example. Mexico, since 1972, has had only one gun store in the country.
One gun store?
The powerful gun that you can legally buy in Mexico is a .22 caliber short round bolt action rifle. That's not the gun that the drug gangs are using in Mexico.
Not at all.
And Mexico, their murder rate has more than doubled since 1972.
Hold on to that thought, John. We'll come right back and pick that up. John Lott with us. We'll take calls with him next hour on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, John Lott with us. John, you were talking about the situation in Mexico. I'll let you elaborate on that.
Sure. Well, only about less than 0.1% of the adult population in Mexico legally owns a gun. They've had very draconian gun control laws since 1972. Just to apply for a permit costs like over $2,000. And when I've testified before the Mexican federal Senate and House, I've had senators and other legislators come up to me and tell me that they can't even get approval sometimes for being able to go and own a gun for protection. And yet Mexico, since they had virtually a ban there on legal ownership of guns, their murder rate has more than doubled. In some recent years, the murder rate in Mexico has been more than 6 times higher than the murder rate in the United States.
Are they primarily drug-related?
Yeah, no, they are. But drug gangs basically can bring in weapons from around the world just as they bring in the illegal drugs.
That's right.
If I could click my fingers and cause all illegal drugs in the United States to disappear and all guns, how long do you think it would be before illegal drugs started coming back into the country? 20 minutes if you're in El Paso? And how long do you think it would be before they would bring in the weapons that they need to protect that extremely valuable property? It's not like a drug gang can go to the police and say, look, this other gang stole our drugs. Can you help us get them back? They have to essentially set up their own little militaries to protect that valuable property that they have, and they wouldn't bring in the drugs unless they had the weapons to protect it. And drug gangs, just as they can make money from selling illegal drugs, can make money from selling the weapons that they have too, and they're a major source of illegal guns.
Most of the murders in Mexico, though, are drug-related to drug-related, right? There's very rarely is an innocent citizen shot, right?
No, I mean, they will kill innocent people that get in their way sometimes, and they'll do it for intimidation too. They'll go and kill the families of police officers and what have you. It's really a horrific situation, the high murder rates that they've had. In some states in Mexico, they'll have a murder rate that's about 100 or more than 100 per 100,000 people. Just as a reference, the murder rate in the United States right now is about 6 per 100,000. So you can get an idea. I mean, that's like 20 times higher in Mexico than it is in the United States, in those northern states.
John, are there any polls in the United States with regards to guns and gun ownership?
Oh, there are polls all the time. My problem is that I think the polls are not very useful the way that they're written. I can give you a couple examples.
Sure.
Back in May, NPR and PBS, our public outlets, had a survey that got really massive news coverage, not just on their huge network across the country for both public television, public radio, but other media picked it up. And one of the survey questions that they looked at was, for reducing violent crime, do you support protecting gun rights, or do you support gun control safety regulations? And the problem is, I like to think that people on both sides of the debate are motivated by safety. I don't come to the conclusions I do because I just want to protect gun rights. The issue is whether or not allowing people to protect themselves makes them safer or not. And when our public outlets did this survey, they got a lot of attention because they say, look, 60% of the people want regulations that will make us safer. Only 38% supported gun rights. But if you go and you instead ask them to reduce violent crime, do you think it's more important that we let people use guns to protect themselves, or do you think it's better to have gun control regulations to protect people. What you find is it's essentially tied. It goes from a 22-point margin down to, which is statistically significant, to one that's essentially a tie between those two questions. But we see this all the time. I testified before state legislatures, like 10 or 11 times this year. And what you see time after time is gun control advocates will go and point to surveys on so-called red flag laws or on background checks on the private transfers of guns, these so-called universal background checks, and they'll say, look, there's overwhelming support. The problem is how the questions are phrased. So for red flag laws, what they'll do is they'll say, do you support a judge being able to temporarily take away a person's guns if the person is a danger to themselves or others? And you'll find 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 support for that. The problem is that's not what red flag laws do. That's the law already. That's what civil commitment laws do. There's a hearing. Mental health care experts are involved. If you simply ask people, ask them the same question, but note that there will be no hearing before the judge makes the decision, that the judge will just get a written complaint from somebody, and also that there are no mental health care professionals involved. It goes from 2-to-1 support to almost 2-to-1 opposition to the law that's there. You take background checks on the private transfers of guns. The way, they'll boil down what can be 30-page laws that they have there into one sentence. And I can understand why they don't want to read 30 pages to somebody to go and ask them a question whether they support it or not. I mean, that's understandable. But the way the question ends up getting worded is basically, do you support background checks on the transfer of guns to try to keep criminals from obtaining guns? And what you find is, 95% of people support that. The problem is, if you just tell people a couple things. So, for example, you'll go and say, does your opinion of this law change if, let's say, a woman who you know, who's trained and has no criminal record, calls you up and tells you that her ex is threatened to come over and harm her? Do you think it should be a felony for you to be able to temporarily loan her your gun? Because under these background check rules, you go to jail for 5 years for temporarily loaning her your gun. Some states have what they call an imminent danger exception, but that means that the person literally has to be right in front of her when you lend her your gun, and as soon as he leaves, you have to immediately take the gun back from her. You might as well not even give it to her if you have to be there to give it to her and take it back. She can't tell you, I think he's coming over an hour or a half hour, and you lend her a gun there, you'd be committing a crime. You ask people that question, it goes from 90% support to people opposing it. You ask them another question, like your local scoutmaster asks you if he can borrow your shotgun for a day to take the scout troop for their shotgun merit badge. Do you think it should be a felony for you to temporarily lend the scoutmaster, who you know, the gun for a day? And again, people go from having overwhelmingly supporting the law to being opposed to it now, simply by just telling them that one fact. So, everybody wants to believe that there's massive support for these things. But you look at Bloomberg stopped putting these background checks on the ballots in 2016. Those are the last two states. He did it for Maine and Nevada that year. He failed in both states. In Maine, he lost by 4 percentage points despite outspending his opponents by more than 20-1. So if there's really 90% support and the media is giving unfailing favorable coverage of the initiative, and you're outspending your opponent by 20-1, you shouldn't lose. You had a similar situation that occurred in Nevada. And you can see from the fact that they've stopped putting them on the ballots because they spend massive amounts of money, and it didn't work for them.
What about the banning of certain types of guns, John? Like some of these assault semi-automatics and things like that.
Right. Well, I mean, Biden many times over the recent years has called for a ban on all semi-automatic guns. The thing is, I'm not sure most people know what a semi-automatic gun is, or at least a lot of people don't. It's essentially a gun where one pull of the trigger, one bullet comes out, and it reloads itself. One pull of the trigger, one bullet comes out, and so on. And the thing is, there's a reason why about 85% or so of the guns that are owned in the United States are semi-automatic guns. They're very useful for people defending themselves. If you are, let's say the alternative for a semi-automatic rifle is a bolt-action rifle where you have to literally physically yourself chamber another bullet after you fire your gun, that takes time. And so if you are facing multiple attackers, or you fire and miss, or you fire and wound but don't incapacitate the attacker, you may not have the luxury of time to manually reload your gun. And so, they can go and ban semi-automatic guns, or they want to just ban assault weapons, sometimes they say. But, the notion that somehow you're going to stop the criminals from getting a hold of those very guns that you're banning, it just doesn't seem very serious to me.
Can guns be obtained illegally, easily by people?
Yeah. No, I mean, the example in Mexico, the example with drug gangs, even in the United States. You would think that if we banned all semi-automatic guns, that the drug gangs in the United States wouldn't get a hold of them in order to protect their property when they're having to fight other drug gangs?
They're the ones that would have them.
Yeah, and if they have them and they can make money selling them to criminals, they're going to make money selling them to criminals.
What are pistol braces, John? I'm hearing a lot of talk about trying to get them banned.
Right.
What are
in
they?
fact, the Biden administration has put in rules that will do just that. As of the end of May, if you didn't go and register your pistol brace and take it off your gun, you're a felon, technically facing up to 10 years in prison. A pistol brace is essentially a strap that fits to the gun and around your arm. And it was developed about a little bit over a decade ago for veterans who had been injured, either losing part of their hand or been partly paralyzed in their hand. So it makes it so that they can hold the gun when they have the recoil from the gun.
With one hand.
Right. If their hand is partially paralyzed, it may be very difficult, or they've lost part of their hand, it may be very difficult for them to hold the gun when you have the recoil there. And so the Biden administration points to this mass public shooting that occurred in Boulder, Colorado, where the mass murderer there used a pistol brace. And there's one other case before that where something similar happened. But, they make no claim that somehow that made a difference, that these guys were disabled, that they had any problem holding the gun that was there. There's like no serious cost-benefit calculation there. You have millions of disabled people who are able to use a gun defensively because of the pistol brace, who couldn't do it otherwise, who are now criminals if they keep it. You've only a very tiny portion of the people have registered their pistol braces. Maybe 5% or so have done so, and you would think there would be some trade-off, some investigation about, how many crimes are we going to solve as a result of this? How many crimes are we going to stop where getting rid of this would have made a difference? And I can't see even one that they pointed to as a result. It's not like we have a lot of disabled people going out and committing crimes with pistol braces. And how many people now, look, disabled people are relatively vulnerable. They tend to have crimes committed against them at relatively high rates because criminals view them as relatively easier targets. So they actually probably benefit more than most people from having the option to be able to go and defend themselves with a gun. And so, it's really sad that there's really no serious kind of discussion of the trade-offs that are there. It's just part, unfortunately, of a lot of what the Biden administration is doing. We just had some numbers that came out a couple days ago that indicated that the Biden administration, with its zero-tolerance policy, has put literally thousands of gun dealers out of business during their first 2 years in administration. This is this policy where if a licensed gun dealer makes any paperwork mistake, no matter how trivial, no matter how inconsequential, they lose their business license.
Wow.
Could you imagine if we applied that rule to government agencies, that if a government agency...
They'd all be shut down.
Yeah. I mean, who hasn't made over the last 15 years one paperwork mistake on all the paper that they do?
Are there some states doing a better job with gun policy than others?
Yeah, no, there's a huge difference across the states. We have 27 so-called constitutional carry states now. These are states where if you're legally able to own a gun, then you're going to be able to legally carry it. And it's made a difference, I think, for two groups of people. It's made a difference for, let's say you have a woman who's being stalked or threatened. Just to go through the approval process, once you've filed everything, it can take any place from 2 months all the way up to a year to go or more, actually, in Connecticut, to go and get your concealed carry permit approved. Well, a year or even a couple months or even a month might be much too long for a woman to wait to be able to go and defend herself.
Especially if she's being stalked. John, we'll talk more when we come back after the break, plus we'll open up the phone lines. If you own guns, if you're opposed to guns, if you like guns, check in with us.